Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Camillo Boano. I've stepped in chairing this research event, part of the post-pandemic planning in the South event, and I stepped in instead of my colleague Haim Jacobi, who had a little emergency to deal with. I'm very happy you all have joined. I see several people in friends. I'm sure that there are others that will follow via social media. The event of today is titled Researching Development Planning During Pandemics, Ethics, Method, and Impacts. And we're going to talk through with three different colleagues. Rita Lambert, she's Associate Professor at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit, where she co-leads the MSc in Urban Environment and Sustainable Development. With Emmanuel Ostuye, he's Environmental and Social Development Researcher at the Development Planning Unit in UCL. And Sonia Marzi, who's joining us from Colombia at the moment, fellow at the London School of Economics, Political Science, in the Department of Methodology and International Development, and she's an affiliated academic at the Latin American Caribbean Center. Now, what we want to, and I'm just giving a few little words of guests, and then I'll pass the voice immediately to the first speakers, Rita, then Emmanuel, and then Sonia in order. Each of the speakers would have about 15 minutes to present and to offer a reflection on a very important topic that we all have been involved with. So the idea and the challenge is to explore the ethical dilemmas of conducing and conducting remote research that we all have been involved in the last 2 years. So the pandemic affected absolutely heavily all of the work. And so we want to draw with the discussion on global North, global South collaboration that are part of the DNA of our department and our commitment. And so developing and reflecting on the collaborations that we have developed through the partnerships, through the different methods, and critically discussing that, of course, imagining and being explicit on the fact that research is a dynamic site of power relation and hierarchy, and those have been affected by and through the pandemic. So we want to discuss with all of you how the current research, environment, practice, ethics, and processes can support communities, and whether knowledge co-production, doing together, and all the other terminologies that have been either invented or reproduced during the pandemic are somehow possible, desirable, and effective in the whatever we would define post-COVID era, which is still a big debate of discussion on the usage of COVID. So without further hesitation, I welcome you all to open for question in the chat or after that, and we're going to read it through with the help of Armando after. So without further ado, let me immediately give voice to Rita. And Rita, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining this panel. So Rita, off to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Camilo. Can you hear me well? Yes, okay, I'm going to share my presentation. Bear with me. So thank you, Camilo, and thank you for having me here. So what I would like to speak today is basically during the past 2 years of research, I have found visual methodology to be particularly important for my work and my research. So I will focus on these and the ethical dilemmas. As many of you know, there's a really important body of work on visual methodologies and ethics from diverse academic disciplines, including geography, cultural studies, health studies, performance studies, etc. And also actually from practice, for example, humanitarian and aid organizations taking a critical stance towards images they use. So many discussions cover the way visual methods are reworking familiar ethical principles and introducing new kinds of ethical risks. So ethical issues cannot be boiled down, of course, to a set of instructions, and we all know this, and require careful and open reflection on the practice of research and the context. So some ethical issues encountered by visual researchers are actually very familiar to all social research. This prevent or minimize potential harm, anonymity, confidentiality, informed consent, and so on. But there are other issues that are more prominent in visual research. And essentially, there's here a summary on my left, on your right, sorry. And the summary does not cover the range of ethical issues fully. So it is actually worth thinking through these 2 years of pandemic to also see what is heightened with the increased uptake of digital communication technologies by low-income groups and researchers alike. So the visual tools and social media have been key to document the impact of the pandemic and share collective grassroots initiatives. And we see a lot of initiatives around the world that have sprung up and really consolidated over these 2 years. And for researchers, I think although the pandemic has hastened the experimentation and uptake of remote visual methodologies, there is limited critical consideration of how these methodologies might actually create or exacerbate extractive approaches. So for all the good intention of promoting co-production being removed from the field, we researchers revert to this disembodied gaze provided by the camera, the computer, the iPad, and transferring textual and visual material to be repackaged elsewhere. In the sense, these last 2 years could have actually re-edified the university as a center of calculation, drawing from the peripheries. And the intrusion of such methodologies can really be problematic. In some research I have actually been involved with, we were asking inhabitants to take pictures or film their environments, and essentially for their body to hold the camera for us. And therefore, no longer there was this negotiation in the field and the interpersonal relationship that determines if you have access or not to certain intimate spaces like the home. So the tool inserted seamlessly without the participant being necessarily fully aware of what is being captured and what the implications are. And social research is, of course, grounded in tacit and therefore potentially quite problematic conditions of trust between us as researchers and the participants. And as you can see from the quote from Bourdieu, because researchers bear responsibility to protect participants from the dangers of exposure and misrepresentation, it's quite, if not anxiety, visual research should elicit conscientious attention to risks that are arguably heightened by the descriptive and explicatory potential of these images. So also during the pandemic, research felt even more intrusive and at times even violent because communities were facing immense difficulties and traumas, loss of livelihoods, loss of lives. Can it ever be ethical to carry on as usual? How do we acknowledge what is going on? I also often ask myself during these times, can we research or can we think the research process to contribute to forms of healing? In remote visual research, we also need to discuss the ethical premise of passing the camera. There can be false perception that we are relenting control. So key is looking at who has the power to determine the narrative that actually accompanies those images. There's, of course, a long history of practices that passing the camera comes also with the expectation that this unique revelation will be afforded with the native's gaze. However, even when we pass the camera, we need to remain aware of symbolic violence. And symbolic violence is always around the corner, despite the best intentions. Even in the most collaborative, horizontal, and emancipatory research setting, symbolic violence is inherent in the practices of accessing, positioning, questioning, gathering data, and actually interpreting them. So implicitly constructing groups as marginalized with difficult conditions of life clearly shows the dangers associated with gaining social acceptance. The risk is always around the corner to enact these violent images that arbitrarily impose symbols in ways that perform the reality according to the assumptions, the taken for granted, and the stereotypes, especially when marginalized groups are involved. Yeah, stereotypes go really very deep, and you have to work really, really hard to examine your assumption, and a strong commitment to helping one another to see the blind spots that we may have. If we strive for emancipatory rather than reproducing research practice, we actually need to strive for an antidote to this symbolic violence inherent in the practice of research and representation. If I have learned anything during the pandemic, is the need for all of us to retrain, to critically see, to interrogate the process and the outputs of the images we commission, we collect, and we consume. I want to here just show you the Reframed project, which we got to its feet during the pandemic. It was precisely seeking to decolonize the gaze, to be aware of the stereotype and the engendered racialized subjects, and really to focus on the ethics of representation, not just on respect, but the active attack on symbolic violence. The project is a collaboration with our long-standing partners, Senca in Lima and Kotakita in Solo, and it was done with inhabitants from each city. And what we try to, through this collaboration, is to interrogate situated ethics in visual research with an openness to difference. So imagine we have here very, very different contexts, you know, very different languages and completely different time zones. So openness to difference, to the cultural and social sensitivities, and confronting visual stereotyping. The aim being to capture the untold stories through the collective narrative construction. And the idea is not just to train participants on how to use the camera. I know a lot of other organizations have been doing that and really with incredible results. But the idea here is to, at every step, confront the biases and raise awareness about the power and the ethical implications of every single stage. So adopting a critical and reflective approach that examines mundane events in a way that exposes broader social processes of control, power imbalances, and the symbolic mechanisms that impose one set of preferred meanings or behavior over others. I don't have time actually to go through in detail, sorry. But just to give a concrete example, the exercises were very specific, and it was very important to make them that specific. Sorry, I don't know if you can see yourselves reflected here, sorry. But for example, in one of them where we were looking at representation and power, how do you translate that to an exercise? And really, we working in pairs, we gave exercises with the first instance being that the camera holder decides the position and the subject and what to ask the subject and film that. And then they do this in pairs. And the second exercise is where the subjects decide the position and space and response to an open question. So I'm responding as you please. And in the third, the subject filming himself and deciding everything upon that, how to represent himself. These exercises were actually key, not only to experience how it feels with every exchange or every change, but also to develop the confidence in participants to ask for how they prefer being represented. So it's also about really that, to be able to create that confidence within. Personally, actually, not to drag it, but personally, what was extremely valuable in the collective learning over the pandemic, and especially this project, where it was, because it was so intently looking at the ethical issues, that we researchers and participants were truly learning together. And by that, I mean, often we talk about co-production and co-learning and so on, but it feels often like you know, kind of certain directions are given one way. So, for example, when learning about sequencing, we would do it together, actually from the 3 different cities. So, for example, making a cup of coffee or making breakfast was one of the sequencing. We shared this from our different locations simultaneously. So there was a true give and take. And I see your intimate space, and you are actually seeing mine at the same time, you know. And I think that for me was very unusual, you know, as a researcher, to be able to kind of go and film my kitchen and film my things. And at the same time, someone's doing it in Indonesia and Lima, and we were sharing it. So this open and reciprocal exchange makes for that level playing field. And another fascinating aspect was to witness the possibilities of exchange regardless of language and cultural barriers. I mean, we had Lima speaking in Spanish, in Solo in Indonesian, Bahas, and us in English. But because we have gone through these 6 intense weeks of training and exchanges between contexts, there was actually a common understanding of what we were actually doing. And then, so situated ethics was performed live. It wasn't something that was within this abstract notion residing within the researcher, but held by the group, which was dispersed and these culturally embedded participants. So I think for me, it really enhanced reflexivity and the sharing of thoughts, which inspired a research of ethics with a double potential. One, to open the spaces for more symmetrical relations and enact emancipatory process of mutual recognition, to produce knowledge that could challenge the dominant stereotype and establish a common space of betweenness between us as researchers and between these very different contexts. So I'll stop here because there's no conclusion as such. It's an open debate, but I would just like to say that I think precisely, I think this really pushing the way we do research and the way we use images, because they're becoming so very important, especially when we are so remote, is absolutely critical at this time. And really, when we do co-production, that is not notionally so, but we are truly are pushing fast and putting ourselves, our research, in a very uncomfortable situation of also revealing parts that we wouldn't otherwise. So thank you, and back to you, Camilo.
Thank you very much, Rita. You were absolutely perfect on time, and you kick off with very important messages about the visual connected to the reflexivity and the in time, the simultaneous dimension of the production. So thank you very much. Emmanuel, off to you, and thank you very much for your being here and sharing your thought in the 15 minutes that you have been given.
Thank you very much, Camilo, and thanks a lot, Rita, for that fascinating presentation. And hello to everyone who's in this afternoon, wherever you are. I'd like to zone in the more practical lens and to reflect on this topic and reflect on this conversation from the perspective of a project that I'm a part of, has been going on for the last 4 years, and for which the 3rd year COVID hit. And to reflect on some changes we've had to make, you know, practical changes we've had to make. And within those changes, begin to tease out some of our dimensions and ethical dilemmas that we've had to face. So I'm not talking about ethics as separated, but talking about changes within a live project and within which ethics come about. And also reflect on some lessons that we've learned as an ongoing iterative process. Through those lessons, we'll think about some of the impact that, you know, changes made that consider dimensions that a pandemic can bring, and hopefully we can open up to some conversation and questions later on. So I'm going to share the screen, and hopefully you can see it. And the title of my presentation is together, we can't be together. So as simple and as practical as that. I work in the middle of a large project called the KNOW project in the DPU, Knowledge and Action for Urban Quality, across several partners, across several geographies, so about 12, 13 cities, where the central work is doing together knowledge co-production on thematic issues, development challenges of resilience, extreme poverty, etc. So we're working with partners in situ, working with people that are experts and have a long range of experience on these issues. And then COVID hits. So as you can see from the diagram, it was conceived in a way that our doing together meant a lot of fluidity, a lot of traveling, a lot of field work. And so when COVID hit and the restrictions to movement came, it threatened the very core of co-produced knowledge through the traditional approach of doing together. And so how do we continue doing together when there is a pandemic? And I think the first thing we need to do was reframe what remote research meant. I mean, we're doing some elements of our work remotely anyway. There were monthly calls, we're using Zoom long before Zoom became popular. We should have shares in Zoom at that time. I always myself and say, if I needed to make money, I should have bought shares when we started the KNOW project. But we're doing together and doing remote field work. But because of COVID, we began to think about what it means to do work remotely and how that has an impact on the kind of research that we're doing. So what can be done remotely, feasibly, and what conditions, what the ethical implications were, and what the areas of research that could be done and why. And I think that these four components collectively as a project with our partners is an important step. And for those of us who are in other larger scale research endeavors, I think that together as a project, we develop a tool to be able to reflect these four dimensions before we can actually call remote research. So as far as we're concerned, remote research isn't just the ability to conduct some elements of field work or some ability to use some kind of tool and questionnaire, but the ability to understand what it means to be remote in itself across the partnerships, across whoever involved in that. And this is very important because assumptions are where the ethical dimensions can also come in, and assumptions can be critical to the progress of the project. And I think that as a project, our lens really was in the maintenance of the partnerships with equivalence. In partnerships with equivalence as the way in which we work with people across these geographies, so that actually remote working isn't just the production of outputs, production of data, and the collective analysis of data. Actually, that falls under a sub-umbrella of the maintenance of partnerships with equivalence, so that we're able to maintain these partnerships. Then through that, we'll be able to do fieldwork, we'll be able to analyze data, we'll be able to do, etc. And then we'll be able to balance what it means ethically for our partners and for ourselves. So we elevated the partnerships and the maintenance of these partnerships as the lens through which we would conduct fieldwork. And so what did we change and what did we do to change our approach? I think that there are four considerations. These are not specific considerations that we needed to do. The first thing was to assess the changes to the needs and priorities of our partners. I think that this is where assumptions are not helpful. And I think that we've looked at with partnerships, our monthly meetings have about 60 people in there across 13 institutions, across 12 cities. And so we needed to work timelines, plans, events, outputs, do collective stock taking to ensure that priorities around the table are considered. And this is very important when you work with partners overseas and you work with partners on large projects, that you are taking into account people's priorities and their needs. And that is the ethical approach in which we began to work. I think that, again, the other consideration was to bridge the digital divide. I mentioned that we were working online and remotely in different dimensions anyway. We were using Zoom before it became popular, but the pandemic meant that the digital divide was now widened, and remote working was introduced in areas where remote working was the norm. Lockdowns were introduced in places where, without access to the office, electricity in private homes was not even guaranteed, internet access in private homes was being guaranteed, etc. So there were many things that needed to come up to redefine what a digital divide meant in the first place. So digital divide is not just about internet, but it means the skills, tools, the devices, the technology, electricity, etc. And so working with a large team, we evaluated what team access meant and what appropriate digital tools and processes and data management, etc. needed to be done, and what kinds of support we could provide across the project. Again, the ethical considerations in doing this with our partners. I call something the cut and expand. I think that with COVID, it meant that part of our research focus needed to be, in that 3 years in with 6 months of a heavy period in the initial periods of lockdown, etc., we needed to cut some things out. But also, in terms of it opened up some elements of creativity and some elements of re-exploration. And it meant that the cut that necessarily did not mean that it was a diminished quality of output or quality of research, but actually cutting back allowed us to expand in new areas that followed the emerging trends. One thing that was clear that COVID was in urban areas harder than any other parts of the countries where we worked in. So the urban focus of our research was there. One thing that was clear was, again, that COVID actually accentuating the inequalities that we're studying and we were already interested in, and people were marginalized and in settlements were being hit harder, and it was a bit invisible in the bigger narratives that were coming in the day. So actually, COVID allows us to cut back, but to expand our research focus and open up new opportunities. Actually, new partnerships and new relationships were done. For instance, in Dar es Salaam, our partner, the Center for Community Initiatives, we were working with in a number of informal settlements, was able to expand its work and bring on board other NGOs that were working in water sanitation to be able to provide PPE to these informal settlements. And I think that that was a wonderful way of expanding new partnerships, new relationships, a way that allows our partner CCI to be meaningful in the ground, but also does not allow them to be endangered to the risks of doing research in COVID, because actually partnership, the new NGO that has a specific focus and funding for water and sanitation, allow them to be able to provide the necessary PPE. Also, as researchers, we're able to open new outputs that we hadn't quite envisaged. So actually we have new articles and we have new papers that we didn't plan for. The unplanned nature means that we have new outputs as well. And also, I think what's quite important in our consideration of things was the redefinition and reallocation of tasks and activities and allowing the relationship, that dynamic relationship of partnerships to begin to flourish and take life and to renegotiate roles and what kind of support that can be done. As much as partners in the field were navigating and serving this gatekeeping roles already, they now took on a more leadership role, and we're following and supporting in different ways. I think that dynamism is a very important thing to highlight and change and what we can learn from it. And so a couple of images to show you. This is a shameless plug, as we call it now. This is an article that we produced with partners in Sierra Leone that talks about fighting COVID in town and the critical role of community organizations, citing the partners that we're working with in the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center and highlighting that agency and that role and what we done and the ethical considerations that we took. Again, information management was very key in the work that our partners did, for instance, in Dar es Salaam, Sierra Leone, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and the provision of critical PPE so that we are not just researchers. I think that dilemma between research and agency was really tested. COVID hit. I remember convening meetings with partners here in the DPU and really reflecting that what is the limitation of research? To what extent can we do research with partners in formal settlement and not help them in the time of COVID, when all we need is, we know that they need is more support for PPE, etc., to be able to live out the basic protocols of prevention of care. When the WHO says that you need to wash your hands and sing happy birthday 2 times, and people don't have water to even drink, how do you support partners to do this without that balance, without breaching that balance, without breaching that carefully negotiated expectation of our role as researchers and not as NGO workers, humanitarian providers? That balance needed to be renegotiated carefully so that we could keep our relationships with partners intact. I think learned in the next 4 minutes to round up is that there is a value that co-production plays in pandemic research. And that value goes beyond data collection, it goes beyond fieldwork. as I mentioned, there is a continuous relational dimension. We elevate it through the phrase, through the concept of partnerships with equivalence. When you think of partnerships, when you think of maintaining the relationships you have with your partners, actually everything begins to fall in line and work begins to fall in line. The creation and the curation of spaces of collective working outside the field has become more critical in the pandemic than ever before. How to meet with partners, how to dialogue, how to create continuous flow of communication, how to ensure that there is the reciprocal flow of communication, how to ensure that there's a translation of the information that we are generating, etc., is very important. And we are continuously thinking about the creation of new spaces and the curation of the existing spaces. We're drawing on the leadership capacities of different members. I think that leadership is not static, and that is how we've learned in the co-production, that we balance the powers, and that the university is not just the knowledge provider and versus the other partners, and the NGO and the community are not just community members. I think that in writing, we have literature, we've written position papers about it, but the pandemic begins to test it. To what extent will partners begin to take on leadership roles? And to what extent can we support the leadership of partners, particularly with data analysis and the reporting functions, etc., when we are unable to be together to do that as we conceived on paper? And leadership and that transferability and that fluidity of roles has been an important thing that we've learned in this period. Again, to be aware that we should not deal with assumptions. Being aware of the assumptions and dealing with it is a very critical thing. And continuously reflecting on what assumptions are embedded within the assumptions. I call it a cascading chain of assumptions. Sometimes actually one assumption is nothing but a series of four. And so when you deconstruct your assumptions in your relationship with your partner, it allows you to reflect a little bit more and to be able to tease out the ethical considerations that need to be made. For instance, availability and time and cost and the unintended impact. And we think meetings on Zoom to be more ideal, but people also have lives to live with, and managing, work-life balance and family life balance and the stresses that have come with it, the mental toll, the mental health toll of working during the pandemic across the world is a topic that needs further investigation. And when we work with partners across these geographies, it comes up a little bit more and we are a bit more conscious about it. Finally, I think that experimentation and creativity really is at the bedrock of working period like this. I think that the biggest phrase that stood out when COVID happened was that we're in an unprecedented time. And the word unprecedented has been used in an unprecedented number of ways. And so experimentation and creativity is what we have resorted to, where we find out what works and stick to it. It's okay to try things, and it's okay as researchers to say, you know what, this fails, this doesn't work, we're gonna stop it. And that's what we've decided to do with our partners. And we've learned to simplify. I have learned to simplify. I've learned that there is value in simplification and adapting processes. We developed so many tools, and Miro and Blackboard and all these wonderful web-based tools that are for workshopping and collective work, etc. But sometimes the simplest ones are the ones that works with partners. So to try which ones work, a simple live Google Doc is what I used with partners to write that paper that I shared in the previous slide. It works for us, and that's what we stick into it. So simplifying processes and adapting processes is a very important thing. And lastly, I've realized that it is more stressful. Zoom fatigue is real. And so we find spaces to enjoy the journey, to get to know each other, to find a way to build a team. I think a team is not just in paper, not on name, not in contract, but in reality. And I've realized the pandemic period tested what my understanding of teamwork really was and my value I placed to the team. And in this lens of maintenance of partnerships with equivalence, we've learned to put a premium on enjoying working together. If you enjoy working with somebody, it makes a big difference in these difficult times that we went through. And finally, I would like to point a couple of places where you can look for further information. On our project page, there is a 19 dedicated for all stories from around all the partners that I've mentioned. Tens of them, about 30 different stories and blogs of what people were doing, just to see what really happened. And then within our newsletter, the second one, newsletter number 4, we had a headline piece, which I've drawn some of these reflections for this presentation: doing together when we can't be together, co-authored with the PI of the No Project, Professor Karen Levy. And so kindly check our website and check it out for us. And with that, I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manuel. Thanks a lot. Incredible journey through reflections in especially this idea of maintenance. I'm sure will trigger conversation later. Thank you very much. And I'll pass to the last speakers, Sonia, again for another round of 15 minutes, and then we're going to have about 10 minutes for discussions and conversation. Sonia, off to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Camillo, and thanks, Rita and Emmanuel, for these fantastic presentations. I think what I'm going to do here is actually build a little bit in both of those presentations, but it will be a little bit more practical. So I understand myself as a scholar activist, as a human geographer, but also as a methodologist. And what I do today is think a little bit about what we did remotely with audiovisual methods and film during the pandemic. And I mostly want to focus on a lens which has to do with power and participation. And many of you know that I'm actually currently in Colombia, where all my research takes place and where also my remote research takes place. And I'm reflecting at the moment on many questions of, is remote the future, is in person the future, or where do we have actually advantages and disadvantages in either of those? However, what I want to do is I want to actually start sharing a trailer of what we did to show first the product, and then I like to talk a little bit about the process. And I always do the same thing. I don't give you the audio as well, so let's do it again.
Yo tenía un celular que lo tenía dañado. Entonces me tocó reinventarme la manera de conseguir este equipo para ser parte de este proceso.
Que esta película lleve un alivio a los corazones traumatizados por esta pandemia.
El gremio de la música totalmente desempleado, entonces esto afecta también a la familia extensa. En varias ocasiones ha tocado poner el trapo rojo.
Cuando se observa el trapito rojo es porque hay gente en dificultades, es gente que necesita algo para comer.
Tenemos dificultades para salir, porque nos digan algo, que cuando menos piense se encienden balaceras, que nos digan para adentro, no pueden salir. Entonces, ese es el temor mío de las fronteras invisibles.
La violencia se refleja en algo roto. Es un daño que nos queda a las mujeres para toda la vida.
Todas las noches hay oscuridad, pero tenemos la esperanza de que el sol sale y todos los días ha salido. Entonces no, ánimo, esta pandemia no nos va a acabar.
Queremos decirle a la ciudadanía que los bordes y laderas también los utilizamos para sembrar comida, para construir la paz. Queremos contarle al mundo que las mujeres somos echadas para adelante, que las mujeres somos resistentes y las mujeres somos memoria.
Para reinventarnos y encontrar una salida, de seguir con nuestros sueños, continuar con nuestras vidas y mirar por la ventana disfrutando del paisaje, tratando de asimilar lo que al momento ya no encaje.
So this is a quick trailer of the film we did in 2020 until March 21 during the pandemic. It's a 32 minutes documentary, which is now online on the webpage reinventar.org. I'm happy to share that later on a little bit more. And I'm going to share my slides to talk a little bit about this process. So when the pandemic hit, the biggest problem for me was that I actually planned to go to Colombia to do this research, to do this film with women in person, and obviously that wasn't possible. However, rather than stopping and actually not including those who are most effective, naming women during emergencies, into a process and telling their stories, what I decided is to shift to a remote design where I asked the women to use their cell phones to do actually the filming. So there was a need to go online. There was basically a need to do this remotely, and there was a need to do that quite quickly, where we didn't have the time to plan that properly in the way we wanted to. So we are kind of happy what actually was the outcome of it. We shifted, so all my research is about the use of urban space from a gender perspective, and here we shifted to the impact of the pandemic, and this was actually led by the women. So they decided on the theme. We continued from this project. So this is in Medellin. We are now doing it in Medellin and Bogota, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the next project we are doing right now.
Sonia, excuse me, Sonia, maybe you can put the presentation full screen so people are seeing the slides where you're moving.
Oh, I actually did. It's not working then.
Okay, okay then. So
is that
just move.
Can you see it now?
We see a second with Reinventadas co-producing knowledge about.
That's okay. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry if my internet connection might not be the best. Yeah, so what we did is like, we got the women together, we did this. We are basically working in different areas in Medellin and now as well in Ciudad Bolivia and Bogota. And we recruited women through a form of snowballing through WhatsApp. So because I had contacts before in 2019, I have been here working on the right to the city from a gender perspective. I asked women I knew to actually snowball through contacts, which then became a recruitment in 4 comunas here in Medellin. We did something similar in Bogota and the new project, which is funded by the ESAC. So the basics of what we do in this research is we do meet weekly on Zoom. So we use Zoom like everybody did during the pandemic. Zoom became the standard, but we also have a WhatsApp group through which we do all the communication, all the questions, all the editing questions, all the technical questions, etc. So we started with training. All the women have cell phones. This is often a question I get. Yes, they do. They do have cell phones. We provided internet, which we can do here remotely. And we started teaching them how they can use their cell phones for filming in a way that we can use the filming they provide in a certain quality to edit a film. So then we would actually reflect on the film material. What are the themes we see? What are the problems we want to send? What are the messages they want to send? And we even started editing in front of one screen, where women would then choose time codes and actually create the film they wanted. So the whole process was participatory from the beginning to the end, and the whole process was online. And we did it in the peak of the pandemic, which means even the women wouldn't see each other in the first months of the project. Talking a little bit about what Emmanuel said, that there are certain ethical implications of, can we do this research during a peak of the pandemic when people have very different thoughts, and these were many tensions we had to think about, can we do this? On the other hand, in our case, actually, because we were in the peak of the pandemic and basically here in Colombia, nobody could really leave their houses, making this film had a form of recovery effect, where women were quite thankful to actually have a project and to tell their stories doing this. So I think the process so far is more or less clear, and I'm happy to answer any questions about it. What I want to focus on is really things I'm thinking a lot about lately, which are the tensions that come up, which are mostly related to issues of power and participation. This whole project is a collaboration between academia in Colombia and in the UK. That means me and Colombian researchers work on it, but also filmmakers who are practitioners who come in with a very different lens. So we have basically 3 parties, which is the women participants, the academics, and the practitioners. And as in many of those participatory projects, this creates some tensions of what are the main objectives of this project. So we had tensions where often the focus really goes to the film, where we have these tensions between product and process, being very much focused on filming and editing. And it is quite difficult sometimes to come back to the actual topics we are talking about and thinking about why we are creating these messages, why we are talking about these topics. And this is something which I feel is something in a remote environment which becomes more complicated. Coming back to what Emmanuel said, like internet is a real issue. While we can provide internet on phones, while we can provide internet to women remotely, that doesn't mean that the internet connection is well. Often having cameras on is not an option because the bandwidth is not big enough. Women drop out and come into Zoom meetings. So the continuity of the process is kind of disrupted by the infrastructure which we have in technical perspectives. That has a lot of consequences for participation. Who can participate, who can't participate is then not only dependent on who is dominant and not dominant in these processes, which we know from in-person work as well, but also who has the better infrastructure and who doesn't. Who is able to turn the camera on and make themselves more present in this online environment and who isn't. That requires a lot of facilitation. It also requires a lot of facilitation between, again, the different interests and preferences of what should be done in a very short amount of 2 or 3 hours every week, where we usually would probably spend 8 hours a day, maybe for 1 week. On the opposite side, there are quite a lot of opportunities that come up, quite a lot of opportunities in the way of how we can come together. So while the space itself might be limiting some forms of participation, at the same time, it enhances participation in a way that we can work with different people from different places, and at the moment, even different cities, every week in a continuity of one project. I believe this is something that we should think more about how to develop this better in the future, because it does create very interesting content of our current project, where we bring together on a weekly basis women from Bogota within different areas in Ciudad Bolívar and here in Medellin from 4 comunas. So this is something which I find is absolutely fantastic. But again, it takes a lot of facilitation to be able to do that. The other thing is that I'm very much struggling at the moment of using the method, being a methodologist, using the method of film, thinking about, and this is a very ethical question we need to really think more about in how we actually use our methods. The film we did, Reinventadas, for the women, this has been an absolute success and they're immensely proud of it. But if we think about the process, how we did this film, it has been done from a Western perspective. What is a film and what is a video has been taught online from a Western perspective. How do we do a shot? How has a shot to be so that it can be edited into a viewable film? These things, they are very much dominated by perceptions of what an audience wants to see. And we are at the moment struggling with this because actually women are starting to take over in this process more and more, which is great, but it also shows us a little bit our limitations of how we were thinking about film. Things where they start to use film in different forms that are quite unusual for us to watch. As something I find is fantastic, but something we really need to reflect more on. Like, what perspectives do we bring into research? What are our initial thoughts of what we want to know, what we want to create, and how much does it actually overlap with the ideas of our participants and how they see the world? So something really to reflect on. Much work has already been done in this sense, and I believe remotely we can start to again develop these ideas further. This is all work in process, so I'm not able to really give any answers to that, but these are questions I try to throw out there, and I hope we can discuss further.
Thank you.
And
thank you very much.
Yes.
Oops, sorry.
No, Camilla, it's fine.
Okay, thank you very much, Sonia. It was extremely useful and interesting, and thank you for connecting so early from Colombia. So I'm opening the floor to each of you, of course. to Armando if he has some questions, to the audience if you want to pose any questions online. If anyone wants to kick off the conversation, the presentation was extremely rich, and I think are all connotated by the fact that there was very much an experimentation, which is super interesting. And I wonder, so what is not research if not an experimentation on one side? So what is actually, and this is probably my question to you, just to kick off, is what is the real experimentation that has happened? Because if research is experimentation, what was the real things that were experimented beyond the digital, which I do believe is something that was, or all of you have connected. So I would be very curious on your take, and maybe quickly on what you really experimented more than others. And second question that I do have, maybe you want to address it very quickly, is small research, big research. This is a question maybe that could come again, and big both in terms of financial and institutional, because I do believe the maintenance remain a key, or the maintenance or the facilitation of the process, just to use Sonia's words, are also something that we might discuss. So really very free, few pitches from you, and then maybe Armando and the others are posing other questions. Maybe let's do the same order. Rita, Emmanuel, and Sonia. So Sonia, take some breath.
Let me unmute myself. Yeah. I mean, Sonia said something quite interesting at the end, which I've been boggling with for quite some time, which is, you know, gaining legitimacy and credibility from the outside also means having to use its dominant forms of representation, mainstream form of representation that in themselves are quite constraining. And in that sense, you know, can be problematic. So I don't have an answer for that, except that it was a question when we were working, and in terms of experimentation around that, we always found it a bit strange, and it needed more time. And I guess that it needed more time, and it needs a bigger research, because you are between, you know, having to transfer the skills of, for example, in this case, filmmaking and so on, and sequencing, storyboarding, editing, all of that. But at the same time, also kind of looking at the aesthetics and the politics of that aesthetic, right, as well. So, I mean, in that sense, I feel like every time you do anything, you are unraveling so many other questions that in order to kind of which one to follow is always an issue. We did definitely, I think any small research leads to many more other research. So eventually it just keeps growing. But I would say in the case that I've seen, where was the experimentation is really those points that I mentioned, which was that kind of simultaneous working across contexts, but revealing part of your own life in a very vivid visual way without any kind of other mediation, you know, kind of conjuring them in just words and so on, was quite unusual for me, you know, unusual and experimental in the sense that did that create a different relationship between the researchers and participants? I believe it did. And it created a different relationship to my own work and how I will go about doing the work when I go to the field, because it is that intrusion when you feel it as well on this side. It was, so I think that was an experiment that really destabilized my position as a researcher. And of course, you know, the experimentation was also around, you know, how do you communicate with such different teams with different cultural, from different cultural backgrounds, but also languages and so on, but make them not just us always as facilitators between these different partners, but how do you get them to speak to each other? You know, we always talk about research, you know, international research, kind of creating network of collaborators around the world. But I always feel sometimes we put ourselves in that central position and we are the ones, you know, kind of negotiating and facilitating the conversation. But I found it really extremely innovative, I would say, to really do it where they start speaking without us being mediators. So there was many other things, but those are the ones that come to mind. I'll let others talk.
Thank you very much, Rita. Thank you very much. Emmanuel, then Sonia quickly, and then we have another round.
No, thanks. I think I agree with what Rita said, but very briefly, I would also add I think that the centrality of the experimentation really was around the use of tools, the development and use of tools, and finding what works, and the simplification of tools for the purpose of research, of data collection, of analysis, of representation, visualization, etc. All the things that we had set out to do. I think experimentation with tools in the pandemic remotely is a learning curve that we all hadn't sort of been exposed to in the dynamic or in the depth to which we were when the pandemic hit. I think there's something with time. There's a temporal dimension with working remotely and working across geographies and working in the pandemic that plays a strong role when you talk about experimentation. How long are we experimenting for? To what extent are we trying and testing and testing the waters? To what extent are we resting before we launch back into work when COVID actually hits, because we're all overwhelmed? I think the consensus of time and pace and saturation and all these things come into play in the experimentation of the research. And I think finally, something we also experimented was roles. I mean, expanded roles within expanded teams. I think traditionally you work with your main partners and a lead partner or head of the institution that you partner with. But within that organization are lots of other colleagues that sometimes junior, early career researchers that sometimes can be hidden in the process. Pandemic brought all of them back to the forefront because there were new roles for everybody to do. The expanded roles meant that actually early career researchers in situ in these countries became more visible. And one that for me, that was my observation. And I think that that was a very important thing to work it out, and we hope to maintain and encourage. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Sonia.
Yeah, I do basically agree with Emmanuel and Rita, and I can only add that in some form it's a little bit of an ironic question, because apart from outside the pandemic, we were not really allowed to really experiment. Like the whole system in academia is built in a way that we need to know what our outcomes are. And I think in this sense, the pandemic has not something that we didn't have before, and I actually see that as a very positive point. And I have been very lucky to actually receive the grant that allows me to use money to experiment methodologically. So asking about experimentation, I think is great, and I think we should continue doing this and be brave and do experiment more, and maybe try to shift a little bit the field from that we need to know our outcomes up front.
Thank you very much. I'll pass Armando to you, because I see there is also a question from the audience, so leave it to you.
Thank you, Camilo, and thank you, Sonia, Emmanuel, and Rita for being today with us, and to all our participants, to our audience that is here. I just wanted to read one question to start from Caterina Pozogon, and this question is for Sonia. She says, thank you so much for your presentation. Sonia, so you mentioned that strong facilitation was required to keep the project going. What do you mean with this, and what are the implications? That's one question. And I also want to add another one myself for all of you. Some of you, Rita, especially, and Soya, in the trailer, you mentioned the idea of research as healing and the potential of research as a healing tool or possibility. In the trailer, also some of the women interviewed said that only by sometimes speaking or talking, that's already a way of relief. So I wanted to ask you, all of you, or any of you, what do you mean by this idea, or what do you think could produce this kind of idea of research as healing in times of pandemic or any other crisis in the future? I have one more question. Sorry, so maybe that's the last one, I think, and then we can just wrap it up. A question from Lorenzo Mauloni, also for Sonia. He says, this is more a curiosity, to be honest. I worked in Medellin in the past and noticed a reference in the video. Did the relationship between gangs and local citizens change through the pandemic? Or which kind of relationship did they have? Were the gangs reinforcing national policies, etc.? He says, I think about Brazil, where Bolsonaro was denying COVID, while the paramilitaries were imposing the lockdown in the favelas. Thank you so much. So that's it.
Okay, I try to do this quickly. So the facilitation thing is actually that adds on to something what Rita said. It's not just facilitation, it's also collaboration. The research I do is highly complex because of the Colombian context. So I'm working very closely with my Colombian researchers together here, and they are actually leading the facilitation of the workshops we do. I'm quite try to be in the back during Zoom meetings. It's very fast. It's very fast what is happening. It's very context specific often what is discussed. And I have fantastic people I work with who are able to manage this in terms of context, but also knowing how to manage if somebody is taking over online, because that is more difficult than in person. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of in-person workshops here, and it is much easier to manage dominant parties in these workshops in person than online. And this is just because of the method of being online and not being able, cannot just mute somebody because they are talking, obviously, that would be completely disrespectful. So here I really have great facilitators who are really well done, who really know well to step in and manage these different dynamics. That needs a lot of training, and it needs some skills and talent, I think. Quickly to the Armando, the question about recovery, I don't think I can really do it justice. The context I work in, the trauma women have experienced I work with, this is so huge, this is so big. Everything we do at the moment is about resistance and activism as an answer of structural violence they suffered and as a form of recovery. So that is really big, but I promise I will write about it very soon. And let's leave it there then. The other thing about gangs and relationships, this is a question I'm taking a little bit a step back from. It's a sensitive topic. It is something that is also a form of trauma and hurtful here. During the pandemic, I would say if it has heightened or lessened, the answer is it depends on the neighborhood. It depends on where we are talking, who is active in that area, and how much this has been regulated or not by other gangs. So the power dynamics are quite complex here. And I don't think I can give a real answer to that question. Sorry for that.
Thank you. Rita, Emmanuel, final comments to Armando's questions or anything? No, okay.
I think that's a good answer.
Excellent. That's, I think, is fine. So thank you very much, everyone who participated. Thank you for the question. I think is, as usual, when we're dealing with mega massive changes in research practice that cut across ethics and the reflective dimension, the amount of questions are more than the amount of answers that are available. And I think the great work you have done, and thank you for sharing that with us, are actually posing a continuous attention to the way in which both institutions, individual, collective, are adapting to this new situation. However, would be a post or not, for sure, there is a way of an interesting condition of working towards a more equal way of doing research that is respectful for the many structural violence around which we are all embedded. So thank you very much for your time, for sharing the respect. Thank you, Armando, and everyone who organized the meeting. Thank you all the participants, and I'm sure we're going to continue the conversation around the post-pandemic city. So have a good rest of the day or the night, and I wish you all the best. Ciao, ciao, bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everybody. Thank you, Camilo, Sonia, Rita, and Emmanuel. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.